Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is the show where we take a whole stack of sources, articles, research notes, you name it, and really boil them down. We try to get to the most important bits of knowledge and insight. Our whole mission is basically to give you a shortcut to being, well, truly informed, hopefully with some surprising facts, maybe a little humor, just enough to keep you listening. So today we're doing a deep dive into one pretty extraordinary day, June 17, 2025. This single day saw just a staggering number of major global and U.S. news stories break. It's almost overwhelming when you think about the sheer volume of significant stuff that happened like all at once. It really felt like history speeding up.
It really did. It was a day that just highlighted how connected everything is,
Right.
and how fast our world is changing. So our goal here for this deep dive is to help you cut through all that noise, to understand not just what happened, but maybe more importantly, why it matters, and how these events, which seem really separate, might actually be linked. So yeah, let's unpack this day.
All right. So first up, let's talk about those global geopolitical tremors, big shifts on the world stage. On June 17th, 2025, that long simmering tension between Israel and Iran, it just boiled over, escalated right into open warfare.
Yeah, and this wasn't like out of the blue, right? It was building for years. Regional rivalry, Iran's nuclear program, all of that backdrop.
Exactly.
But on that day, things got kinetic. Iran launched multiple ballistic missiles. They were targeting central Israel, Tel Aviv included. They claimed they hit a military intelligence center.
And Israel's response.
Swift airstrikes on Iranian missile bases, nuclear facilities too. They specifically mentioned the Natanz enrichment complex, which is, a key part of their program. And our sources were also saying Iran hit districts in Tehran and the Tabriz airbase. They even claimed partial control of Israeli airspace using some hypersonic missiles, apparently.
Wow. And the U.S. President Trump reacted pretty strongly, didn't he? He cut his G7 trip short.
Oh, absolutely. Immediate and forceful. Came back early, demanded Iran's unconditional surrender, that's a quote, warned about possible U.S. military intervention, even told Tehran residents to evacuate. That kind of language definitely ratcheted up the tension globally.
You can imagine. And the human cost.
Yeah, that was immediate too and pretty grim. Hundreds of civilians killed or injured, both sides. Reports mentioned over 200 fatalities just in Iran, and the markets reacted instantly. Global energy markets disrupted, oil prices spiked, big fears of a wider Middle East war.
Right.
The international community, G7 included, they called for de-escalation, but honestly, the risk of a bigger regional conflict felt and still feels really high. We even saw a U.S. senator try to put brakes on Trump's war powers. And an interesting side note, Iran had internet outages, right? So there was apparently this covert rollout of Starlink satellite services, helping press and activists get information out.
Fascinating. That kind of direct state-on-state conflict, it could really reshape things in the region for a long time.
Nope.
Okay, shifting focus now, but sticking with global conflict. Ukraine. That same day, June 17th, saw one of the deadliest attacks there, too.
Yeah, another major flashpoint. Russia launched this massive combined attack, hundreds of drones, over 30 missiles, hitting Kyiv, other cities, and they were hitting residential areas, critical infrastructure. It wasn't just military targets.
And this was a particularly bad one.
It was the third largest strike of its kind since the war started, based on the numbers we saw. It flattened a 9-story apartment building in Kyiv, Solomyansky district. At least 23 people killed there, over 130 injured. Awful. And there were other strikes, too, in Odessa, other regions.
And President Zelensky's reaction.
He condemned it, called it terrorism, naturally, and immediately renewed his calls for more international support, more weapons, more aid.
So what were the immediate ripple effects, regarding Western aid, air defense debates?
Well, it definitely intensified those calls for more robust military aid from the West, and it sparked renewed debates about how effective the current air defense systems really are against these kinds of massive barrages, plus the immediate impact, widespread power outages, more people displaced, just a brutal reminder of the human cost.
Yeah, a brutal reminder. And all this is happening while world leaders are trying to meet, right? The G7 summit.
Exactly. The 51st G7 summit in Kananaskis, Alberta, June 15th to 17th. It was actually the 50th anniversary. They were supposed to be focused on global economic stability, climate change, digital transformation, the usual big picture stuff.
But the Israel-Iran crisis just blew that agenda up.
Completely overshadowed it, yeah. The preset agenda, all that planning just went out the window. Leaders had to pivot, focus on the immediate threat of this potential Middle East war.
And Trump leaving early really underscored that urgency.
It did. The G7 put out a joint statement calling for de-escalation, affirming Israel's right to self-defense, but also urging restraint from everyone.
Mm.
But, that meeting on the 17th, it just perfectly showed how these big international summits are now kind of at the mercy of whatever crisis explodes next. Less proactive strategy, more reactive diplomacy.
And even within the G7, there were some interesting tensions surfacing, weren't there? Beyond the main crisis.
Oh, yeah. Especially around Russia. Trump was actually arguing for bringing Russia back into the G7.
Really?
Yeah.
What was his reasoning?
He argued that maybe, just maybe, if Russia had been in the group, the Ukraine war might have been deterred, which is quite a statement.
Yeah.
And notably, he skipped his scheduled meeting with President Zelensky.
Hmm.
He also used the summit to criticize the EU on trade, hinted at tariffs on pharmaceuticals, and he set a deadline, July 8th, for trade talks with Japan. So yeah, it showed how fragile that consensus can be, even among allies.
And all this geopolitical stress, it hit the markets hard, right?
Immediately, yeah. The Middle East tensions, plus those U.S. trade worries, it fueled a lot of volatility on the 17th.
So what did we see specifically?
Oil prices jumped about 3%. European stocks slumped pretty much across the board, and investors ran for safety, so assets like the Swiss franc got stronger.
And the outlook.
Analysts were warning, if this conflict drags on, expect sustained higher energy prices, slower global growth. Pretty standard, but worrying.
Okay. But there was one positive diplomatic note from the G7, Canada and India.
That's right. Amidst all the tension, they announced some foundational steps to rebuild ties. Relations had been strained for years, trade issues, security stuff, diaspora politics.
So this was seen as a bit of a breakthrough.
It was. Leaders met bilaterally, agreed to work on new economic and security agreements. A positive sign, at least.
Okay, so let's pivot now. Moving to the U.S. domestic scene. June 17th, 2025 was also a day of some really shocking events here, too, starting with just unprecedented political violence.
Yeah, this was truly chilling. Political violence hit a new, terrible level. Minnesota State Representative Melissa Hortman and her husband were shot and killed.
Horrific.
Authorities were calling it a targeted political assassination. State Senator John Hoffman and his wife were also wounded in the same attack. And the details are disturbing. The gunman impersonated a police officer. The suspect, Vance Belter, apparently had a hit list. Other lawmakers, Planned Parenthood centers.
God, the impact must have been immense.
It shocked the whole country. Bipartisan condemnation, of course. But it immediately reignited these really intense debates about political extremism, gun control, and just the basic security needed for public officials. An event like Hortman's assassination, it's a terrifying example of how political polarization can just metastasize into actual targeted violence. It really shakes the foundations of democratic discourse.
Absolutely. Shifting to policy, but still in the political realm.
Yeah.
The U.S. Senate.
Yeah.
The Republican-led Senate unveiled a major bill, right? A new version of Trump's legislative agenda.
That's right. Some were calling it the big, beautiful bill, borrowing that Trump phrase. Significant changes proposed.
What were the main goals?
Basically, to make the 2017 Trump tax cuts permanent, or at least solidify them, and reshape federal spending for the next decade. Key bits included deeper proposed cuts to Medicaid, reducing the child tax credit, rolling back some green energy incentives, and making certain business tax breaks permanent.
How are they planning to pass it?
Through reconciliation. That's the procedural loophole, basically. Lets them pass it with just a simple majority in the Senate. No need for Democratic votes.
So sparking a big debate, I assume.
Oh, definitely. Democrats warned about blowing up the deficit, hurting vulnerable people. Republicans argued it would boost growth, bring fiscal responsibility, the usual battle lines drawn.
Okay. And elsewhere, the Trump administration's immigration policies were back in the news.
Yeah. DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, resumed raids. Farms, hotels, restaurants, part of a wider push to increase deportations. There were high-profile raids in LA, other cities, and that sparked widespread protests.
Right, the No Kings protests. Some of those got pretty intense.
Some reports said they did, yeah. Mentioned fires, looting, injuries, arrests in some places. California's Governor Newsom called the federal actions a breach of state sovereignty. Pretty strong language. Trump, on the other hand, labeled protesters insurrectionists, threatened to send in more troops.
And there was a legal challenge in New York, too.
There was. A Supreme Court judge there, Judge Mary Rosado, blocked Mayor Eric Adams' plan. He wanted to let ICE reopen an office at the Rikers Island jail complex. The judge sided with the city council, basically saying the mayor didn't have the authority to do that on his own.
So all these events really underscore those ongoing tensions, don't they, between federal and state power within the legal system, judicial oversight playing a key role.
Exactly. And we saw another example of that judicial check on power at the same day. A federal judge, William Young, ruled against the Trump administration's move to cut certain NIH research grants,
Which grants were these?
specifically ones focused on things like gender identity, diversity, equity, or inclusion research. The judge called the cuts arbitrary and capricious and discriminatory.
So what does that ruling signify, broadly?
Well, it clearly reaffirms the court's role in checking executive power, right? Especially when government actions seem to lack a solid legal basis or appear discriminatory. It protects scientific funding to some extent from purely political interference.
And another significant court case concluded that day, involving Mike Lindell.
Yes, the MyPillow CEO. A federal jury found him liable for defaming Eric Coomer, who worked for Dominion Voting Systems. It was about false claims Lindell made regarding the 2020 election. The jury awarded Coomer $2.3 million in damages.
That sends a pretty strong message.
It does. A powerful warning about spreading election misinformation. It shows there are real legal consequences for making false claims that damage people's reputations, especially around something as fundamental as elections.
Okay. Let's shift gears slightly to the economy. What were the indicators telling us on June 17th?
Well, not great news on the consumer front. U.S. retail sales actually fell nearly 1% in May. That data came out around then. Suggests consumers were being cautious, likely due to economic uncertainty.
What drove the decline?
Slower car sales, less spending at restaurants and bars, things like that. Raised some concerns about how strong the economic recovery really was at that point.
And at the same time, we saw a wave of layoffs.
Yeah, a pretty broad wave across major companies, tech, finance, media. Seems to reflect cost-cutting, but also maybe a bigger strategic shift, possibly driven by AI adoption.
Which companies were involved?
Big names. Intel was cutting up to 20% in its foundry division. Disney, Meta, Microsoft, Morgan Stanley, PwC, even retailers like Kohl's and Wayfair, all announcing job cuts. So yeah, suggests businesses were really recalibrating, adapting to new tech and economic pressures.
But it wasn't all negative on the corporate front. Some companies were adapting to consumer demands in other ways. Kraft Heinz, for example.
Right. That was interesting. Kraft Heinz announced they're getting rid of all artificial dyes in their U.S. products. Aiming for 2027, they said they'll also stop launching new products with synthetic coloring.
And that's purely driven by consumers.
Seems to be. Responding to that growing demand for healthier, more natural ingredients, more transparency, it shows how market forces can push even giant companies towards, well, more responsible practices, depending on your definition.
Okay, let's look at societal shifts and environmental news from that day. In Toronto, something significant happened regarding Indigenous healthcare.
Yes, St. Michael's Hospital held a ceremonial opening for an Indigenous wellness center. It's seen as a really important step towards addressing health disparities, promoting culturally sensitive care for Indigenous communities in Canada. Offers holistic health services, traditional healing practices alongside modern medicine, a potentially important model.
And environmentally, a major weather event in the U.S.
A huge storm system swept across the central and eastern U.S. Severe weather, hail, tornadoes, flooding. The National Weather Service had warnings out for over 100 million people. Just another example in that pattern of increasingly extreme weather, which scientists link to climate change.
And sticking with global connections and potential environmental or health impacts, the Trump administration signaled changes to travel bans.
Yeah, concerning news there. Indications they plan to extend U.S. travel bans to potentially 36 more countries, mostly in Africa.
And the criticism.
Critics warn that blocking researchers, scientists, health workers from these countries could seriously undermine global health efforts, could stifle research on emerging diseases, like Marburg was mentioned, and ultimately it could hamper U.S. leadership in global health security. Highlights that tension between national security and global scientific collaboration.
And speaking of global environmental issues, June 17th was also a UN Observance Day.
It was the World Day to combat desertification and drought. Just highlighting the scale of land degradation affects over 3.2 billion people currently. Colombia hosted the main event that year, focusing on sustainable land management, reforestation efforts. Important stuff.
All right, let's wrap up this incredibly packed day with just a few quick moments of note. Some other headlines from June 17th.
Okay, first one. MI6, Britain's foreign intelligence agency. They announced their first female chief, Blaise Metroelli, who was overseeing tech and innovation. A big milestone for gender equality in that world.
Definitely. And in sports, hockey fans would remember
Ah,
this.
yes, the Florida Panthers won the Stanley Cup. Their second consecutive win, beating the Edmonton Oilers, cemented them as a real NHL powerhouse.
Okay. What else? Something from space.
A solar flare. An X-1.2 class flare erupted from the sun from active region 4114. That's one of the stronger types. Authorities were monitoring for potential impacts on radio communications, satellites, that sort of thing.
And sadly, a tragic incident in New York City.
Yeah, really sad. A 14-year-old boy was critically injured subway surfing, fell onto the tracks. Apparently, there had been 6 fatal subway surfing incidents in 2024, and 2 already in 2025 by that point, prompted more safety campaigns about how incredibly dangerous that is.
Just awful. And finally, the passing of a well-known figure.
Yes, Anne Burrell, the Food Network star, known for making worst cooks in America, she passed away at 55. A lot of people were saddened by that.
Wow. Okay. What a journey through just one single day, June 17th, 2025. I mean, from direct military conflict between nations to huge shifts in U.S. domestic policy, economic jitters, that historic appointment at MI6, it really shows the sheer density of events happening all around us.
It really does. And if you try to, connect the dots, pull back for the bigger picture, it just underscores how interconnected everything is. A conflict over there impacts markets everywhere. A domestic policy decision here has ripples across society. Understanding those links and just how fast things can change, it's really key to making sense of the flood of information we all face.
And that's really what we try to do here with the deep dive, isn't it? We hope this gave you a clearer, maybe more connected view of what was unfolding on that one specific, very busy day.
Yeah, and it leaves us with a question, really, for you, the listener, to think about. When you have so many huge events, global, domestic, all hitting on a single day like this, how do we, as citizens trying to stay informed, how do we even begin to process it all? How do we prioritize the information that actually helps us understand where the world is heading? It's a real challenge.
A challenge indeed, something to definitely mull over. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, and we'll be back soon to explore more sources.